Bojana, welcome to our winter school. We are glad to host you, and we are happy and pleased to introduce you and your lecture. So it gives me pleasure to present Bojana Romic after Esther's discussion on virtue ethics in terms of robotics and technologies, after Mark's intercultural thinking about technologies and robots. We have, and Julia's lecture about role of gender and gender stereotypes in robotics. We have pleasure also to speak with Bojana Romic, senior lecturer in media and communication at Malmö University in Sweden. Her focus is on science and technology studies, image politics, and importantly, cultural and artistic aspects of robotics, important for this particular presentation. She worked on projects such as Robot as Technocultural Icon and Artificial Creativity. In fact, her most recent work includes co-editing a special issue titled Artificial Creativity for Australian journal Transformations. Her current presentation examines creativity in context of artificial intelligence and robotics, and the title of the presentation is Here Comes an Electronic Artist, Communicating Discourses about Robots in the Creative Process. So, Bojana, thanks for accepting our invitation to join our School of Personal Robotics, especially today when we are discussing ethical and socio-cultural aspects of robots, and we are happy and pleased to welcome your talk.
Thank you very much, Boris. I have to say I'm very, very pleased and humbled for being here. It was a great discussion yesterday, more kind of a tech-oriented. And I have to say I'm a media and communication scholar, as Boris mentioned. So that kind of a technical side of thing doesn't really sit well with my knowledge. So I'm predominantly interested in how cultural aspects of robotics are being communicated, especially in media. How do we talk about them? What kind of ideas they provoke, especially for the lay audiences? So yeah, my talk today is really going to focus on this project that just finished. That was the Robot as a Technocultural Icon. The project has been sponsored by EU School for, not school, but coordination strategy for EU coordination, represented by Vinnova in Sweden. And yeah, this is kind of, I'm going to cover quite a few themes, and some of you might not be familiar with some very particular ways of conceptualizing things. So I will have to make a slight kind of a detour at one point. I will indicate when, so I can explain a little bit science and technology angle in kind of researching this topic. I also have to say I'm really sorry that I couldn't join earlier today, because the question of gendered robots is extremely interesting for me, but I'm hoping to see the recording later. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, and now I'm going to sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Perfect. So here you can see a foyer of Malmö University in Sweden. It's very nice, and yeah, it's a lovely environment to work in. So, okay. So I'm showing you here a few examples really of robots and automata that that we are seeing today, that we can that have been exploring this idea of some kind of an alternative to human, or a mechanical alternative to human. What people from the industry might not be very familiar with is that our artistic explorations of robotic technologies kind of ran in parallel with industrial research, and it offered very often a very valuable commentary on societal issues, on ethical issues related to the specific uses of technology, and kind of a general, you could even say, concerns related to particular uses. So here you can see already in the 18th century, obviously this is not a robot, this is an automaton, but you can see two automata by Jacques Droge, who was, how do you call it, a watchmaker. Like he was really extremely skilled with using kind of a very precise mechanics, and both of these automata, they can actually make a very predictable, but still they can produce some sort of an artifact. So in the case of the musical lady that you can see here, she is kind of playing a relatively simple musical piece, and then the boy over there that is called the writer can write something, again, a few lines on sentences on paper, and it can make a very simple drawing as well. And they actually still work. You can see them kind of in action. But it really kind of shows us that this curiosity that surrounds this idea of, let's say, puppets that can do something, you know, they are some sort of an alternative to human being, had been ongoing, and it's part of the fantasy, especially in the Western world here. So although you have also in the examples of dolls from puppets from Edo period in Japan, so it's not really only here, but I'm kind of focusing really on the Western history, kind of broader speaking here. So then I'm showing you here the image of Jean Tinguely, mathematic. This is just one of them. You have several. That was kinetic sculpture, really, that was equipped with a motor, and then it can create drawings that were actually quite, how can I put it? It's a kind of artistic production. It communicates with the artistic production of the time. So really, with the rise of abstract expressionism, this kinetic sculpture really communicated relationally as kind of a form of relational aesthetics to the artwork or artistic production of the time. Then we see Namjoon Paik's and Shuya Abe's robot that could actually walk in 1964. And as part of the performance, this robot was, that was obviously a curated performance, but the robot was let out on the street and then it was hit by a car. And that was really Paik's and Abe's kind of, they raised the issue of what is going to happen once we have these technical agents kind of intermingling with our daily life, and how is it going to, what kind of clashes, in this case quite literally speaking, but what kind of interaction are we going to have, and how this communication may unfold and what can go wrong, right? So this is kind of a very beautiful example of the robot that was made for a strictly artistic purpose. And then there is this famous exhibition by Asher Reinhardt's Cybernetic Serendipity from 1968, which displayed kind of a creative uses of computers. This is a catalog from the exhibition. So really, when we talk about engaging computers and robots in some kind of artistic production, it has a substantial history. So it's not really a new thing in that sense, but of course, it's an ongoing development. Now, kind of a fast forward, and we're looking at the examples of some robots that are invested in cultural production. These 6 robots named Paul by Patrick Tressett, they were exhibited at very kind of important exhibition, Artistes and Robots, that happened in France in 2016. And this is the example of robots that can draw portraits or still nature. And as you can see here on the left side, that is the drawing made by Patrick himself. And then on the right side, you can see the drawing that was made by a robot, but obviously informed by kind of Patrick's very specific stylistic choices. Again, this is not something that happened here for the very first time, although this is really a beautiful, I would say, a beautiful execution of very particular approach in terms of use of medium and in terms of its aesthetics. But we also have the AI actually called Aaron by Harold Cohen. It's also very famous, that had been, again, he has been experimenting with that AI for a very long time. So you can really, you can notice the changes in its development and how it kind of became even more refined stylistically. What is interesting here is that this particular robot doesn't actually have a memory of previous drawings. So it is kind of, Patrick refers to it as a naive drawer in that sense, because it kind of takes that visual inputs and then kind of using basically the pre-existing instructions and codes, then it really works with the data anew in a sense. And then another beautiful artwork, Manifest by German collective Robot Lab. This robot has been fed with a number of different manuscripts, and then it can write 8 sentences on a piece of paper in English, French, or German. And when it's done writing those 8 sentences, then it cuts a piece of paper, and then the audience can take that piece of paper that falls on the floor. Sometimes they actually make sense, these sentences. I mean, of course, they are grammatically correct and all that, but it's in terms of meaning, sometimes they kind of have a very strong meaning and sometimes not. Like on that piece that I had the chance to take, and I still have it, it was written, "The amateurs should be compensated for their labor." So I really love that statement. So yeah, these are the examples of these robots that are involved in a cultural production. Now, you will notice that when I talk about these robots, I'm not saying that I'm not using this attribute creative robots, and I'm going to explain why. I prefer this way of addressing invested in a cultural production, because I think it's important to explain that the robot here is really just one of the agents in a creative process. But I'm going to return to that point in a minute. So what am I going to cover today? These are some thematic sections. So I'm going to address representation of robots in the media, different approaches in analyzing representations of robots. How can representations of robots be conceptualized using STS, Science and Technology Studies approach? Then I'm going also to discuss the role of language in describing technological phenomena. And finally, why does all of this matter? This is a very important question that every time when I write a research application, I have to address. Sometimes it can be difficult to answer this, but I'm going to make an attempt. And finally, I'm going to present very briefly a case study, a robot that I kind of analyzed for one of my papers that was published last year. And I certainly hope that I'm kind of really hitting this golden margin of 1 hour. I'm never completely sure, but I'm going to make an attempt. So first, what is representation? To represent, like I said, the verb appeared in English in the 14th century, by which time the word present exists as a word to make present. So if you wanted, for example, to send someone to be there on your behalf, then that person represents you. But importantly, in the 14th century as well, you got this other kind of added meaning, which was that represent was in a sense of symbolize or stand for. This kind of a second aspect is really important for us today. Like, in a sense, what does representation mean? And we deal with representation all the time, even if we are not really aware of that, because when we use language, we are really using a representational system. So language constructs meanings. And as I will say also a little bit later, really this is a part that I'm interested in. It provokes imaginaries, but I'll return to that. So language is a representational system. We use signs and symbols, that means sounds, written words, and objects that represent to other people our concepts or ideas or feelings. Language is one of the media through which thoughts, ideas, and feelings are represented in a culture. This is a kind of a standard go-to definition of representation by Stuart Hall, extremely influential theorist, British theorist, that published this book, Representation, in 1990. It was republished in 1997. But why is that really important for this team? Because I'm going to look at the ways that we really communicate technological phenomena, and using a very particular type of representation, we are sending, again, a very particular type of message, kind of it's a nicely packed fantasy about that technology. So just another little tool from my theoretical toolbox here, I will use the term non-human a lot. Why am I using the term non-human? I could use the term machine, but I don't feel very comfortable using it very often. And the reason for it is that in the area of media and communication, which is my field, it has a very, very kind of it's a strong word that carries a lot of different meanings. And so you had like very influential theoreticians that were discussing, let's say, a capitalist system as a machine, society as a machine, human organism as a machine. You have some roboticists that think of human body as a machine of sorts. Rodney Brooks is one of them. So I felt that it became a little bit fuzzy. And when I wanted to talk about something a little bit more specific, the term non-human actually worked really well, because I'm literally saying, here are humans, and then non-humans really includes animals, but it also includes robots, and it includes AI. So yeah, in some contexts, actually, the term non-human can function better for me than the rather broad term machine. But then again, this is how I use it, and I have absolutely nothing against using the term machine. I just find it a little bit more precise in some contexts. So concept of creativity. Despite popular kind of understanding, the term creativity, the way we use it today, so we are not talking creatio, like a creation of earth and creation ex nihilo. We're talking about the creativity as a way of describing individual capabilities That's one of the definitions of creativity. That term is relatively new. Actually, it originated somewhere in the 20th century. But then, since it's a very adaptable, it can be applied, it can be kind of a reversed engineer, and it can be applied to individuals that lived kind of in a distant past. So one of the fathers of this area of creativity studies, which is extremely broad, and there are so many people from so many different disciplines that are contributing to the field of creativity studies. So one of the first influential figures was Joy Paul Guilford and his speech at the American Psychological Association in 1950. So he writes, individuals' ability to be creative depends on certain personality traits, such as their flair for divergent thinking, which is usually defined as being able to come up with as many ideas and solutions as possible. And this kind of a broad definition is still very influential, actually. It really it sets the playground in a sense of how do we really conceptualize creativity, and in which ways this definition kind of gets complicated when you include kind of non-humans here. And what does it really say about the cultural production that is ongoing? Now, computational or computer creativity, again, this is a field that is growing, and it's already kind of, I would say, quite established. And this is one of many definitions. I would say that we are kind of looking at a standard definition of computational or computer creativity. The use of computers to generate results that would be regarded as creative if produced by humans alone. Now, most of you here are either computer scientists or in one way or another roboticists. You are very familiar with Alan Turing and his work from 1950s. If you look at it kind of through the eyes of a media scholar, you would actually notice here that what can be what can be found here is this underlying thought that it's still humans that are creative, and then maybe we can discuss if some non-humans can be creative as well. But in a sense, at least judging from this definition, this aspect of human creativity is sort of taken for granted. Now, you have some scientists that have been really like a very thoroughly discussing what does really creativity means, and whether it can be applied, and how, and in which, and who can actually qualify as being creative. Is everyone creative? I mean, all these that I just mentioned, there is at least one person that claimed one of these. So you had like a Joseph Beuys, the Swiss artist from the 20th century, that claimed everyone can be creative as long as they do things the best they can. You kind of really push your limits, and then you can, then you're creative. And then you have people who claim, no. You are only creative if then there is a list. So, it's a very contested field. But if we're to group those into kind of two dominant strands, then we have, I would say, and this is how I kind of try to map this. Position number one would be creativity is primarily a human attribute, but can be negotiated for some non-humans, like I mentioned. So you have a lot of computer scientists and people who are working with theory of mind. They are kind of in one way or another they communicate with this first position. And this is how they conceptualize things. And then you have another position, which claims or observes creativity as a system of mutual influences and shared information. This second position might seem a little bit more problematic and is less explored. And this is the position that really communicates with science and technology studies. So I'm going to explore it a little bit. Okay, but let me start with the first, like the author that is referenced a lot. It's Margaret Bowden. So she's British scientist. She claims that the idea or an artifact needs to be new, surprising, and valuable. These are criteria for creativity. And this is her very influential book, The Creative Mind, Myths and Mechanisms. Now, she offers even kind of an additional step of kind of granularity, where she really explores what kind of creativity can it be. So it can be combinational creativity. So I would, according to Margaret Bowden, many of those GANs would really fall in this bracket, combinational creativity. You have a certain database, and then, you know, by combining and coming with some kind of an unexpected result, something that is really fresh and it really appears to be quite new, then you come up with this kind of a combinational creativity. Then there is an exploratory and finally transformational creativity, which is extremely rare. It's a kind of game changer in that sense, and only a few people in history managed to really reach that transformational creativity, according to Margaret Bowden. And of course, there you would have Kekule or Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, all these people that we are very familiar with. So, so in this sense, you can see that Bowden really tries to come up with, and I mean, I would say succeeds, coming up with some sort of a normative formula, kind of a coming with creativity, and how can it be applied, and how can be kind of, how can we think of it in a kind of a more objective manner. But position number 2 doesn't really sit well with position number 1, but it's informed by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on social strand of creativity. Now, you might know Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and his book Flow. He's quite famous for it, but he has another book on creativity where he explores this. So this is creativity is a system of mutual influences. And from there, we have a number of scientists like Joanna Zulinska, who claims that the creativity is a socio-political construct that may involve humans and non-humans alike. So it's really a process. It's not really an attribute. And this is a very, very different ideological position than the first one. So you might wonder, okay, but we can get it that it might be a construct, but why is it a socio-political construct? Well, over the past few years, creativity, and this is inspired by Andreas Reckwitz's analysis in his book, The Invention of Creativity. I think it was published in 2019, or I think in 2019. Anyway, he writes that over the past few years, creativity has become a pivotal organizing principle in Western societies, represented by a desirable figure of creative worker invested in the creative economy. The regime of a permanent invention, novelty, improvement views creativity as a driving force in society, especially in the niche of the experience economy.
Bojana, I think.
And, you know, creative individuals, and how do we make ourselves more creative? This is really a construct. We kind of decide what does that mean, you know, being creative, and how you should maybe arrange your appearance to look more creative, you know, all these arrangements that come with it. So yeah, he's really emphasizing this kind of a social aspect of why creativity is this kind of a desirable force in society, and how it's being replicated. Yeah, so I mentioned the science and technology studies. It's really a group of theories. It's not, and there are differences, and you know, all these people that are working in the field, they don't really agree on everything, but if I were to kind of emphasize some of the key aspects or approaches, I would say that it really considers historical situatedness of technological artifacts. So when you look at something, it doesn't matter. It could be a micro oven, right? You should really look not only at the actual product, but you should also think how it's being promoted, how it's being marketed, who was observed as a target group, how it maybe how did this technology maybe crushed another technology because of the lobbying process and so on. So all these kind of are really this bubble that surrounds the product is really taken into consideration here. And then it has this really structuralist approach, so relationship to a broader system. You cannot really observe it as isolated thing, but rather really connected with maybe other products and other technologies. And finally, very importantly, it asks what language are we using to describe phenomena? And this third point is really important for my research here. So now, if you think about this second position that I mentioned, so you have really creative process, right? You cannot really ask, are robots creative? Because that would mean that I'm a sole judge of the process, whether creativity is taking place. So that really question doesn't sit well with an STS angle. But what I really ask in my research is what happens when we refer to robots as creative. So this is why I'm saying that really language is really important here. So again, following STS, you look at two agents. It doesn't really matter whether human, non-human, but we're looking at some kind of interaction that is happening. And in that interaction, both agents are kind of being transformed in one way or another. So the non-human is going to get additional input, but the human is also going to learn something from the process. So it's, yeah, the interaction is really key here. And again, briefly, here the detour starts, but it's going to be brief. So it really, this kind of thinking has the origin with really the early development of media studies from the 50s and Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who writes psychologically man. In the 60s, they use these gendered terms, man. Today, we would probably say human. In the normal use of technology or his variously extended body is perpetually modified by it, and in turn finds ever new ways of modifying his technology. Another example, which again, this was written in 1960s, has a slight, this kind of a white savior side to it. I'm aware of it, but I think this is a good example for the point that he's trying to make. So when Australian natives were given steel axes by the missionaries, their culture based on the stone axe collapsed. The stone axe had not only been scarce, but had always been a basic status symbol of male importance. The missionaries provided quantities of sharp steel axes and gave them to women and children. The men had even to borrow these from women, causing a collapse of male dignity. A tribal or feudal hierarchy of traditional kind collapses quickly when it meets any hot medium of the mechanical, uniform, and repetitive kind. So, in the context of what we're talking about today, it kind of shows you that this introduction of a certain technology really changes society. It's extremely difficult to kind of separate specific technology from the society that is really experiencing that kind of technological innovation. And this was explored even further by Judy Weitzman in her book Technofeminism, where she writes technoscience approaches contribute to an understanding of social change by exploring how technologies and new forms of, I cannot see here, social life are co-produced. Material resources, artifacts, and technology make society possible. To talk of social relations as if they were independent of technology is therefore incorrect. Indeed, what we call the social is bound together as much by the technical as by the social. Society itself is built along with objects and artifacts. And this kind of thinking has been explored even more in a very particular branch of STS called actor network theory, that considers a kind of a passive agency of objects, of material objects. So let's think of a speed bump, right? When you have what's called in Europe flying policeman, that means like a section of the road that's kind of erased. So when you arrive to it with your car, you really have to slow down. So that kind of obstacle really affects your behavior, and you could consider that as some kind of agency that object is really projecting on you, so making you adapt your behavior. So yeah, you can really, when we think normally about agency, we think only about those kind of very particular ways, but agency is something that can be negotiated, and there is such a thing as a kind of a passive agency, but that's for another discussion. And this is, I think, a quite important point. The human is and has always been a technological being, and the history of humankind is inseparable from the history of tools and apparatuses that were at our ancestors' disposal. Now, yes, you will say, yes, this is very obvious, but it's also important to consider that when we think about ourselves, we actually kind of make some sort of an approximation. We are, when I say I normally, in everyday life, I would mean, well, my being predominantly with cognitive functions, right? That's my identity, that is that I. But really, in reality, I am really a kind of a multi-species system where, that I functions only as well when my gut bacteria are working well, or the microorganisms that are crawling on my skin really do their function. So we kind of, there is always this exchange with really other species that surround us. So humans have always operated in an ensemble with a variety of non-humans, because again, bacteria again are also non-humans, both organic and inorganic, including viruses, drugs, impulses, and various tools. So when I say I in everyday life, I tend to disregard the fact that really, technoscience is happening around me, but it's also happening in me. If I took aspirin this morning, it performs some kind of a function in my body. It cannot be separated from me, really. It's kind of this fuzzy field where you have that I with all these influences that are coming from other species and from the products of technoscience. Yeah, this is a vocabulary of Donna Haraway, another kind of important scholar for STS. Now you will say, yes, this is, we know all that. Why is that really relevant? Well, that approximation happens all the time. Let's apply this to something else. Let's apply it to AI in this case. So here you see the example where it says, this was advertised in Flash Art magazine, 10th Bucharest Biennale, the first biennial curated by artificial intelligence in VR. So the text here claims that this AI named Jarvis, it's been created by Spinwerk Vienna. His name is a reference to the AI from Marvel's Iron Man, and then Jarvis came up with a selection. Now, what this text doesn't tell much about is what kind of database was here, and how did Jarvis come up with this selection? You know, what kind of training model was there? And very importantly, when you write that the first biennial is going to be curated by artificial intelligence, you're making another approximation. You're actually claiming that it's curated only by this artificial intelligence or technological system, let's call it, and not by, and you kind of disregard the labor of associated humans, right? So, you know, if we were to be a little bit more correct here, we would say, well, it's a form of co-production between AI and this team Spinwerk from Vienna, because that's what really is. But what really grabs eyeballs here is when you write, it's been curated by artificial intelligence, full stop. That really works great if you communicate that type of information with lay audiences, because they, you know, they get excited about it. You know, artificial intelligence alone came up with this selection here. That's an approximation. Again. Okay, let me see how I'm doing with time. Oh, I have only 15 minutes left. Oh, no.
15 minutes.
Right. Right, there is a Joy Bolamini. She's, yeah, she was the one really to unpack this question of this kind of black boxes of this training data, especially when it came to what she referred to as coded bias. So training data that didn't have a kind of a sufficiently diversified kind of a training model. Anyway, I think very briefly, so from here we have something that is referred to as a myth of technology. So whenever the word machine is uttered, this figure of speech constructs a relationship between human and the technical object within that mythical structure as binary, antagonistic, and ontologically differentiated. So you kind of a myth of technology here is kind of positions humans as kind of a pre-technological beings untouched by technology, and then you have a technology happening somewhere else that kind of affects humans in one way or another. And that kind of a binary you really see a lot in media, you know, with the titles such as, you know, robots are taking over our workplaces. So this is another of this kind of a discursive binary here, where you look as a kind of a humans as pre-technological beings and technology developing and then creeping and kind of overflowing. So this is really something that is that I, as a kind of a media person, feel a little bit, I feel that this is just not right. But let me move on to some to the next point. So we have this AI as a discursive practice here. This is something that this technological myth has been ongoing since the early developments of the field after World War II. As Philip Agre observes, some of the founders of AI were psychologists, and they explained the field in terms of computer modeling of human thought processes. An important issue raised by Agre is that the early phases of AI research, goal-oriented words such as reasoning, planning, and learning served as a designing guidance, and such descriptors have been widely applied to technological systems. So these were very convenient words, even though they might not really describe the process very accurately, because really what, as we are going to see in a few moments, I mean, well, I'm going to stop with this there, and then I'll come to that. Yeah, some of the examples of these films that you're all familiar with, I didn't want to include the pictures because I don't know if that falls under kind of copyright issues. But anyway, I'm sure that you're familiar with many of these, where you see this kind of a very dualistic relationship between, you know, threatening robots in many cases, and then humans on the other side, and they have to adapt to their development. But also, I mean, you have some other stories where you see some kind of interaction, like in Robot and Frank and Her and so on. But many of these films actually perpetuate that technological myth, such as I, Robot or Ex Machina. And this is what's often referred to as technological determinism, external autonomous force exerting influence on society. If you Google AI, like I did this just 2-3 days ago, you will see that all these images are actually very similar. Of course, most of them come from some databases, clearly. But I mean, notice the similarity, right? It's all bluish. It's very neural networky kind of nodes and futuristic and everything. You notice a certain pattern here, right? And then there is this idealized anthropomorphic robot that is then, you know, being produced, brought to life by humans. I mean, these all serve really these myths, how we think of AI, how we conceptualize this. And this slide is quite important, because why is that problematic? Well, it provokes certain imaginaries, right? And as Sheila Yasanov writes, socio-technical imaginaries are collectively held and performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technologies. In other words, when you really perpetuate a certain narrative or discourse, you know, people start really thinking within those. You set the framework for how people imagine future. You know, you're kind of strategically imagining future for them, which is yeah, quite interesting. And something that we should consider. Now, when we talk about robots here, here's another example of some myths. Like Sophia, I've noticed several of other speakers mentioned her already. So the idea that she's basically alive, and here is the kind of a comment. Many of the comments would be good fun if they didn't reveal the fact that many people are being deceived into thinking that mechanically sophisticated animatronic puppet is intelligent. It's not. It has no feeling, no opinions, and zero understanding of what it says. It's not hurt, it's puppet. So again, in some cases, you can really use this kind of as a strategic language to convey a certain message and to provoke imaginaries that are really deceptive for people that are not in the field. And you know, Sophia is really one example of such a product. And I analyzed the robot that is that kind of also, in my opinion, falls into this category. An important kind of concept here by Johanna Seibt from Aarhus University. So she claims that the use of common verbs for human capacities, teach, observe, greet, to describe robots' actions is questionable. She writes that this is really an intentionalist vocabulary, and that vocabulary includes verbs that, according to our common conceptual conventions, imply consciousness and feeling and intentionality, which may be deceptive for the human observers, especially in the context of experimental studies. Now, you know, sometimes, as we've seen yesterday, this can be kind of explained or justified as something that can really kind of nurtures children, or it provokes their imagination and so on. But this is something that we need to be aware of, that you know, we cannot, strictly speaking, the robot doesn't greet, it simulates greeting. And it doesn't have to be always emphasized like that in media, but it's good to be kind of, to have something, to consider that, to really put things in perspective, that is kind of more in line with technological developments and where we are really in terms of development of robotic and AI technologies, and not kind of expect too much from them. Yeah, this is really, again, an example, as I see it, of that kind of a mythical language. And it's author Miller wrote, AlphaGo knew that Lee would be caught entirely unawares. This is, he writes, of course, about the famous game Go, where AlphaGo AI managed to scored a higher result, or Lee, like a world champion, was beaten. So AlphaGo knew that Lee would be caught entirely unawares. That was a killer move, a move no human player would have made. So yes, that was a killer move. That was a move that was highly unexpected. But that kind of strategic thinking of AI is kind of, it's pushing it, right? It's, machines don't really work that way. You know, I use the word machine, but they don't really work as a, there is no way of strategizing in a human sense at stake here. It's something else, it's calculation. So when you add this kind of, you kind of romanticize whatever is going on. And in my view, that contributes to that technological myth. Now, when it comes to creativity and non-humans, I added a few nice, refreshing images here, some explorations here. When I analyzed some of the articles using BuzzSumo, and then I looked at the most popular articles or most viewed articles during 2021. And the top article when it came to robots engaged in a cultural production was this one: "We don't need another Michelangelo. In Italy, it's robots. Turn to sculpt." So I opened this and it was quite interesting because in my view, again, this is an article that feeds into this myth again. So some of the examples here: "If Michelangelo saw the robots, he would tear out his hair," said Michele Monfroni, 49, in his workshop in the mountains near Carrara, where he sculpts Hercules reproductions, cherubs and the occasional police crest by hand. "Robots are business, sculpture is passion." As I've seen actually at the very beginning, robots are really part of the they have been involved in an artistic production for quite some time now, but there is still this idea that somehow robots are, it's not their place in art, you know? Robots are business, culture is passion, you know, robots cannot be passion. Again, I would say a myth. And sculpture is something you have inside. If you use a robot, you also become a machine yourself. Again, one of the most kind of influential articles from last year. Right, I'm going to skip this one because I don't have enough time. I'm just going to maybe steal 5 minutes from, yeah, I'll try to finish in 5 minutes. This is a study that I conducted last year. This is the robot Ada. It was a collaboration between Mellor Galleries from London and Oxford University. And here you see the robot presenting at Ars Electronica in Vienna. That was in, I think, 2018. Anyway, so the robot, as you can see, it's an anthropomorphic robot, and it can draw portraits using cameras in its eyes. So the Ada newsletter claims Ada is the world's first ultra-realistic humanoid AI robot artist capable of drawing robots from life using cameras in her eyes and a pencil in her left robotic hand. She creates artwork based on Professor Margaret Bowden's philosophical definition of creativity, that it must be novel, surprising, and of a societal value. Now, I've chosen this case study for several reasons. First, it's the embodiment of the robot with its recognizable facial semiotics, creates space for this simulacrum and evocative iconology. The fact that Ida has a supposedly female appearance opens a series of questions about gendered social robots. The robot is presented as an artist, prompting questions about the so-called creative robots and the connection between the embodiment and agency serving the purpose of electronic personhood. And finally, using the opaque word movement in the knowledge sharing context, the website politicizes communication from the very beginning using the barrier of selective access. Obviously, this was my question. How can anthropomorphism and transhistorical discourse affect the political presence of Ada robot? Why is it a transhistorical discourse? Because it really communicates with some, well, you know what, I'm just going to return to that in just 1 minute. Let me read this slide now. When the robot is being exhibited to the public, given a name and a personal pronoun, a set of kind of discursive strategies are put in place, which would serve the process that I later refer as individuation of robot. So the individuation happens when this surrounding social robot undermines or disregards the labor of associated humans to make the robot capable of performing a certain action, just like the Jarvis that I mentioned previously. So when you write something like having been brought to life, Sophia is already a marketing plaything, right? So, and then you have this, you have a setup where the robot is set in this kind of a Victorian atelier surrounded by paintings in this kind of this scenery that portrays the robot as a lone Victorian genius. You're communicating this with a much longer tradition of artists that kind of fit that picture. You know, you would have, let's say, Beethoven or Leonardo da Vinci, and you create that what I refer to as transhistorical discourse. You connect something, existing ideas, with something that is very new in order to convey that impression, you know. And in this case, I would say to a certain level, deceptive strategies are used to really promote the robot as an electronic artist. And this is something that Umberto Eco referred to as ironical revisitation. So it's an inspired spectacle that uses all these kind of existing visual symbols to kind of convey a certain message. And part of the strategy for this robot was to be involved in making portraits of all these big kind of historically validated geniuses, such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace, right? And then finally it's self-portrait. So you have this kind of a continuity, which really serves as a marketing strategy for this robot. So I'm sure that you mentioned something very similar in the previous lecture that unfortunately I missed. So again, embodiment of the robot is also being used very strategically. And it also creates this assemblage of meanings and relationships. It's kind of, it works what Haraway would refer to as a material semiotic body, right? It's a material, but it's also it communicates with other bodies. The problem with gendered robots also is that the gender is kind of a fixed artificial feature that is superimposed. So it's, you know, I'm not going to delve into this because I don't have my time is running out. But it's so we have a kind of a interesting strategy where it's robot's very particular way of presenting is coupled with its activity, which means it draws to build this discourse of an electronic artist. In principle, I mean, they could have decided for a completely different design. It could have been a robot like Patrick Tressett. It's some kind of an technical construct that creates drawings, but no, they wanted to go for this kind of a persona. Because it's harder to argue for it to be an electronic persona if it doesn't have an anthropomorphic appearance. So we have these kind of a pre-existing categories of class and power struggle that are mirrored in this technological artifice. And importantly, this robot is kind of situated in this period when you had a kind of by the very end of a kind of a British Empire. So it really links with this feelings of kind of imperial pride. Yeah, so finally, I just want to say that kind of also insistence of robots' firstness and uniqueness shows partial ignorance about the broader realm of robots and AI used in a cultural production. I felt that this chosen strategy may reap some sensationalist titles in the media, but does not really contribute to the situated knowledge sharing. Thank you very much. This is the full paper in the International Journal of Social Robotics. And here is my list if someone wants to make a screenshot of this. Thank you very much.